Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron, and welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I'm so excited to have Mattingly Messina here. Mattingly is the founder of Throughline, which is an advancement consulting firm, works with lots of schools. He's also an advisor in Moonshot Lab. So thank you, Mattingly, for offering your expertise there. And Mattingly, I have a chance to chat a lot. And we were talking recently about this question of like how heads of school can effectively manage up to boards when it comes to questions of fundraising and advancement. And Mattingly has some really distinct ideas on it. I was like, oh, this is going to make for a great podcast. So let's go ahead and get that on the calendar. So here we are. Before we dive in, Mattingly, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I know this was like a long time coming.
Yeah, a long time. I'm excited that we're here. Hey, before we get going, I did a little bit of an intro, but I'd love for you to introduce yourself and the work that you do at Throughline.
Yeah, I'm happy to. First and foremost, I think for anybody listening here, I'm the product of an independent school. That's how I got started in all of this. Product of a school that really, really changed my life as a young person. And, you know, on good days and bad days, that place for me was just one of the things that kept me feeling like my place in the world was solid. And so here I am now finding myself working in independent schools, but it was a little bit of a windy path. I originally had a career in tech. I live in San Francisco. That's the thing to do around here. And started to get more involved in independent schools because I served in a number of capacities with my alma mater. I led their alumni association. And for the past 4 years or so, I've been on the board of trustees there. And that's where I started to get exposed to fundraising in independent schools and why it matters and how we should talk about it with our parents and our communities. And I made a career shift. So there was a director of advancement opportunity here at a K through 12 in the Bay Area where I live. I took that job, helped rebuild an advancement department during a time of transition for the school. And then about 3 years ago, decided to launch a consulting practice, Throughline, which focuses on advancement services and relationship management for nonprofits, but in particular for independent schools. And I've had the chance now to work with schools of all sizes, all across the country to help both heads, advancement staff and leaders and boards think about fundraising that puts relationships first before dollars and cents. And I think one of the reasons I love talking with you, Peter, is you understand and you care so deeply about how complex it has become to run a school. And to me, the differentiator at the end of the day is the power of your relationships to drive revenue. And so if we can get schools thinking about how relationships and revenue are interconnected, I think that schools will stand a chance of, sustaining themselves long into the future.
Well, that's a great jumping off point. So let's start though with the big picture. And when it comes to board involvement in fundraising, just like paint the picture. Like, what is the typical approach that you see at independent schools, and where do you see some challenges with the current its current construction?
Yeah, the typical construction at the board level of fundraising, and I have a unique vantage point as someone who had to report up to boards as an advancement director, someone now consulting with schools and helping heads report up to their boards, but then also as a trustee and a co-chair of the advancement committee at an independent school where I'm now helping set that tone and ask those questions. And so I get to kind of take on and take off these different hats at different times. To me, the board construction for fundraising is pretty similar throughout almost every independent school. There are some that are doing it differently, but a lot of schools are stuck in the same system, which is that it is relatively siloed. There is a development or advancement committee. It is sometimes like pulling teeth to get people to sit on that committee because they are concerned about what is about to be asked of them. Are they going to have to ask for money? Are they going to have uncomfortable conversations? And the work that gets done there is pretty transactional. The development staff often just reports out the status of the annual fund. That board is not really all that involved in the operations of it anyways, as they really shouldn't be. And, from my vantage point, it's really just a series of status updates throughout the year. And then a lot of kicking the tires on the same questions. How do we get more people to attend events? How do we get more people to donate? How do we increase our parent participation percentage? And it really stays there. And so you wind up having, a quarter, a third of your trustees that are on that committee, and they just share things out with the broader board, but they're not particularly connected to the work of fundraising themselves. And then every other committee on a board that focuses on other key areas of governance, they're not really thinking about how philanthropy plays a role in how they get their job done too. And so as a result, boards really, in my opinion, are not doing what they can and what they should and what should be asked of them, but it's not entirely their fault, because I think that they've been plugged into a process that has existed long before they joined the board. And a lot of folks don't know any better until something new comes along and a new paradigm is explained to them.
Why do you think the process took that shape? Like, why traditionally have we gone down that route?
I think we adopted an old nonprofit governance model. And to me, I get frustrated when people compare independent schools to other nonprofits in the way that they're structured and the way their communities are. They're very, very different. An independent school has a million different touch points between its constituents and its mission. And the complexity of this organization is so great. And fundraising is so less straightforward than it is in some other larger national nonprofits. But the governance structure, I think, really was just copy and pasted over. And so as a result, we've got boards thinking that they are focused in their committees on the right things at the right time, but they're not actually really attentive to what's going on in a modern day independent school environment. And as I think we know, boards changing their governance roles and their governance structure is like turning that ship. It takes a long time. It takes a head of school and a board chair in particular that sort of have the guts to go through probably some turmoil and conflict as a board becomes a new type of governing body. And I think fundraising really it suffers the consequences of that limited old model that really doesn't work for independent schools anymore, I don't think.
So, all right. So if I'm hearing you correctly, I think what I'm hearing is that you're advocating that like the traditional model is very siloed, and like, how do we break through those silos and create more cross-pollination across the board? Is that fair?
Yeah, I think at the moment boards are set up to have committees by function, right?
Yeah.
We're going to have a finance committee, an investment committee, a fundraising committee. Well, fundraising is a function, but philanthropy is a way of being. And so when you limit the board's involvement in its advancement to just the function of raising dollars, it's just a line item in the budget that gets reported out. No one is thinking of it any more comprehensively than that. And so both on the board that I serve and with the schools that I serve as my clients, I try to get them to think about the ways they can change their board to be organized not so much by function, but by key focus or mission critical area. And then that way, things like philanthropy or finance and budget can be embedded in each of them, because the reality is they already are, whether boards talk about it or not. So you can have a facilities committee. That's great. But the way you grow your facilities is almost always going to be through either taking on debt or fundraising or a combination of both. And that committee doesn't talk about any of that at all. It just talks about the facilities standalone. That doesn't make much sense to me. And I think as the business becomes more complex, we have got to shift the way board committees are structured.
So you're like talking about functional areas, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And then underneath those functional areas, you may have some people with facilities expertise, advancement expertise, like whatever the expertise you have on the board, but you're giving them a way to come together and do that cross-pollination that sounds like it's hard to do right now.
I think it is hard to do because boards, I think, they cling to the existing structure that they have. And I also want to say, yeah, being a trustee at an independent school is a serious commitment. It's a sacrifice of your time and your talent and your resources. And, these are people that often have full-time day jobs. And so, if a structure is getting them by, but not really having them get ahead, it takes a board that has a lot of self-reflection to be willing to part ways with that structure. And I think that if folks in the independent school ecosystem can continue to talk about how that could happen, I think perhaps more boards would be willing to take that leap. But to answer your question, yes, if you think about a board developing strategic plans and strategic priorities, why not consider structuring your committees around those pillars after they're developed? Within them are always going to be a fundraising consideration, a financial consideration, a teaching and learning, and equity and inclusion. So to me, why not make sure that those conversations are happening at every committee level? And then that way you actually can see how fundraising affects every area. You can't fool yourself into thinking it's just one siloed thing.
Yeah, I really love what you're suggesting because, I advocate a very similar way of thinking when it comes to the school operating system that I work with schools on, which is like thinking about what are the functional areas in the school. Like traditionally, if you look at an organizational chart, you would see, an admission director, and then under the admission director, an associate, and then under the associate, maybe assistant, like a very simplified version of that. But if you're thinking about it more holistically as enrollment as a functional area, well, then all of a sudden, all these other people across the school are going to have input into that functional area. And what that ultimately does is, one, it's going to make your strategy a heck of a lot sounder because you're bringing different perspectives, different voices, but it's also going to do some of the silo breaking that we had talked about earlier in terms of, letting board members share their expertise across multiple domains, and that cross-pollination that's so critical.
You're right. And to me, this is why fundraising at the board level is so frustrating for many trustees. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy. If you shunt it to the side and isolate it, it becomes this thing to be fearful of. And at the end of the day, trustees, I think, mostly are concerned about having to be involved in solicitations. And I don't blame them, because the way that this is structured sort of indicates that that might be what you need to do. There are so many ways to be involved in a school's advancement efforts that are not about asking for money. And one of the people that I look to a lot is a guy named Jim Langley, who was the former vice president for advancement at Georgetown. And he talks, I think, better than anybody about the fact that the ask is really overemphasized, over-indexed. And if we restructured school fundraising to have board members constantly in conversation as key ambassadors to the school about the mission critical things we're working on, the ask sometimes doesn't even need to happen because you have convinced that family or that donor to support you. And I think
oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just reminding me of an earlier episode that I did with Jill Goodman, and she said a very similar thing. Like, we get hung up on the ask, but really it's the relationship. It's cultivating that over time and building kind of that two-way communication so that there's just, a greater, I don't know what the right word is, but just a greater affinity because you're building that relationship over time. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And I'm glad Jill is great, and I think does a wonderful job at exactly that. And when board members are reminded of their reason for joining the board as a trustee, what motivates them, why they sent their child, or if they're an alum, why they attended in the first place.
Right.
There's such a simple exercise that I often do with boards that just allows them to pause and reflect on the reason why they got into this position in the first place as a volunteer. And then when you tell them that's all you need to be an effective part of a school's advancement strategy, because that personal reason and you as a trustee and the influence it carries, that alone can convince people to get on board and to support. And when trustees look at that, they say, oh, okay, wow, I am comfortable talking about that. Maybe I don't need to do something that's so out of my comfort zone to be part of raising money. This isn't so scary.
Yeah. Okay. So we spent the last 15 minutes or so kind of talking about different ways to think about coordinating advancement activities at the board level. Imagine there's a head of school thinking, that makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really curious about that. but where do I start? So like if they wanted to kind of break the cycle and introduce new ways of thinking about advancement at the board level, where would you recommend they start?
I think it starts with naming that dysfunction out loud.
Mm.
In my opinion and in my observation, lots of heads of school try to fix the board's role in fundraising behind the scenes, right? Okay, there are some trustees that are giving us a hard time, or there are some trustees that are not carrying their weight with fundraising. Let's go address this one by one by one.
Mm.
But the reality is, if we want to talk about philanthropy as something embedded in every single area of the school, right? That this is not just about value of dollars, but about values, which every board member should be able to talk about, then we're going to have to speak about it out loud. And I think heads of school can do that a number of different ways. They can do it in a proper formal board setting. They could bring in external folks to help them communicate that message. Sometimes that is what it takes to sort of get through to a board if an outside person doesn't.
Right.
But to me, it takes the bravery and the courage of a head of school to say, I think that the way that we have gone about this is not serving us. And I'm asking the board to consider a paradigm shift in the way we think about fundraising, both from that, the standpoint of the mission of the school, but also structurally. And I think heads of school often try to nibble around the edges because, especially if they're new, they're dealing with board dynamics and relationships that might be complicated about other areas to begin with. And I get it. They're trying to make sure that they are, taking swings where they should. But I don't think fundraising will really change at the board level unless there is a true explicit conversation. And more often than not, it isn't. This is stuff that's going on behind the scenes, and it never really works, in my opinion.
It's hard too. I mean, imagine if you're a new head and now all of a sudden, and you recognize, there's opportunity at on the advancement side at the board level, but I'm like 3 months into the job and, they're the ones who are evaluating me. Like I have a lot of empathy for being in that role, in that position.
Oh my God, I have a ton of empathy for it. And there was a time where I thought maybe I wanted that position.
Yeah.
But sure, man, it takes a special person to be a head of school. And I mean, you are helping people build up those competencies so that people can step into this role, because I think we need more amazing talent than ever. And you're right. This is a complicated relationship because you as the head of school are the board's only employee. And they are responsible for assessing you. And then they're also responsible for supporting you. But then if the relationship really in an ideal world is going well, even though they are your boss, you want a board that is so excited that they do want to serve you and let you run the school how you know best. And so it is a strange relationship that really just on a dime can turn. I often encourage heads of school to, as they develop their business competencies, thanks, Moonshot, to talk about the nuts and bolts with the board and remind the board that fundraising is a key part of their fiduciary responsibility. And as a result, it really can't be avoided. And I think you as a head hopefully look like you're paying attention to the financial sustainability of the school. You're paying attention to the business model. The risk you take is, of course, putting pressure on relationships with your trustees, especially as a new head.
Yeah.
But I can't think of more important things than taking a risk, having a hard conversation with your board about, than the financial sustainability of your school.
Yeah. I mean, this is just my hot take, after listening to you, but it strikes me that you have to have a really good relationship with your board chair and get aligned very tightly around these issues.
It certainly helps. And I think having a weak relationship with your board chair is a quick way to find yourself in a really untenable position. And when that relationship, in my experience, is fractured and there isn't sufficient time spent developing a strong bond, it becomes a very, very slippery slope.
Yeah.
The head of school might feel unsupported by the rest of the board. And if you don't have good governance in place at the board level, that's the kind of stuff that can get out into the community. And all of a sudden, you've got a real cultural problem. And then that cultural problem can lead to financial problems as you try to enroll as many families as you can, raise the funds that you need. And it does go a long way to have a head of school and a board chair say to one another, listen, we are going to have a relationship that is unbreakable, no matter what is swirling around us. And I would hope that a head could lean on a board chair to help have these conversations, but sometimes they don't, and they've got to go it alone.
Earlier you talked about, one strategy could be in terms of structurally, how would you kind of transcend advancement
Mhm.
throughout the board? Like structurally, you could orient it to the strategic priorities and the strategic plan, which I think is a really fascinating idea. What would that look like though in practice, though? Could we dig a little deeper there?
Yeah. So if we take some common pillars that schools wind up adopting in their strategic plans, just as an example, um, well, on the other side, one of the common pillars that you see in a strategic plan that I don't think is sufficient is develop or foster a culture of philanthropy that attracts resources and deep commitment. And that's it. It doesn't go any deeper than that.
Sure.
And so, if you develop plans that are more actionable about, hey, for school access and equity, we want to grow our student population by XYZ, or we want to improve our facilities so that ABC. We already know, as you're sharing people with the school operating system, in order to implement any of those things, you have to think about how they're going to be funded. So to me, that is a great way that boards could structure themselves to help tackle and implement each of those projects. And then the expertise that are in the current board committees, finance, investment, fundraising, marketing, and communications, they have to be part of all of those anyways. And I think that if you structure board committees around your strategic planning priorities, you're going to get more buy-in from your trustees. They just went through that process to
Mm.
adopt and approve these fantastic initiatives. Well, why not keep this structured in a way where they can continue to go and work on those things? And I think, to me, it would be a really, really good first step to have more well-rounded trustees in terms of the areas of school that they affect.
Yeah. It would also give them more exposure, I think, to staff in a way, because if you're presumably you're organizing those priorities and creating committees at the faculty staff level, it could give those folks an opportunity to have a little more exposure to the board and, share idea sharing and all that sort of stuff.
Exactly. And one of the reasons I think that fundraising at the board level can be so hard is because at the board level, you're really only focused on major donor relationships. And you think of fundraising as something that is relatively transactional. And at the moment, if schools ask their trustees to get involved in fundraising, it's mostly in maybe cultivating relationships with major donors or helping the head of school with the beginning of a capital campaign. And I think that just perpetuates that this idea that this is um, a, a scary, difficult, awkward thing. And if you're not personally predisposed to being comfortable asking for money, you're going to want to opt out of that as soon as you can. But when you start to have exposure to every member of the community, different roles, faculty, staff, parent volunteers, you realize that the money you raise, it affects all of them. Like, so for example, I'm working with a school right now that has developed a board committee on equity and inclusion. And in particular, they've got some strategic planning goals that came out of their most recent plan around how they would make equity and inclusion a part of their programming. And they didn't realize at the outset that they were going to have to find a way to fund all of these priorities. And they just said, wow, I think the development committee on the board will take a look at that and they'll get back to us and they'll let us know how we can fund these things. Well, that wasn't happening. No one's coming to give you the answer. And when we were able to make thinking about philanthropy part of that board committee's charter, it got people excited because they were able to realize, oh, this is how we actually supercharge these programs. This is how we make things come to life. This is all of our responsibility. And it just wasn't so scary.
It's extraordinarily empowering, I imagine.
It is. Because you really begin to understand the impact that dollars raised can have
Yeah.
on the life of all of your students. And I think that some board members understand that because they've been exposed to it, but most haven't. And we see heads of school saying, my board doesn't know how to fundraise. my board won't fundraise.
Hmm.
They don't know any better. They have been plugged into a system that for decades has been run the same way. And until somebody gets in front of them and says, hey, we think that fundraising is actually part of your job responsibility as a trustee in a different kind of way, let me share with you about it. I don't blame trustees for the way that they've gotten plugged into this process.
So let's take that example. Like my board doesn't know how to fundraise. That's, in my mind, there's an opportunity there, right? Like anytime you throw a roadblock, there's a way to get around it and get to where you want to go. So if you're a head or you're a senior leader who's thinking about becoming a head or maybe part of these conversations, and they're feeling intimidated by the fact that in that scenario, they likely are going to have to manage up to their board. What advice would you offer?
Well, I would first say stop apologizing for fundraising. I think that a lot of schools do that not just with the families they're asking from, but they do that with their trustees. And they say, listen, I'm so sorry that we have to ask you to do this, but we really need your help. Or they say to the donor, I'm so sorry to have to sort of, put you in this position, but we really, really need your support. That is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It begets what you put into it. And so I think heads of school should be joyful and confident when talking about fundraising. By the way, they may not be. They might have signals to the board that this is not something that we should tiptoe around. It's something that is part of their job and how they're assessed as a head of school. So of course you're going to be bringing it up to your trustees. I think we have too much fear around it. We need to stop apologizing for asking for money. It is literally the way these schools are built.
I love this. And it's also not just asking for money. You're asking them to invest in the school. Now,
You sure are.
you may not they're not going to get a financial return on it, right? But there is some sort of outcome that they're looking for, right? It could be successful execution of that strategic priority that you laid out for me a second ago, or it could be something entirely altogether. But I think like people who have means and want to give, they want to understand like what is the investment going to return for the benefit of the school, for the benefit of the students, benefit of everybody involved. And I just think that's a healthy way of thinking about it.
It is, and there's nothing more powerful than a trustee being able to answer that question.
Yeah.
If the donor is thinking, what is the way that this is going to impact the school? For a trustee to be able to articulate how it will and how it has motivated them to step up as a board member, I find that there's nothing more powerful than closing a gift than that.
I mean, just think about if you were going to get donation from a foundation or, whatever, like there's going to be stipulations tied to that. They're going to want to see that what we're giving you money, what we're investing in programmatically for your school is going to return what you laid out in that foundation grant. I think the same is true for any investors, especially major donors, right?
Yes. And to me, that is a requirement of good donor stewardship. And it's also something schools, I hope, are excited about sharing because you're getting the opportunity to present your impact. It's not just, administrative work to be able to generate an impact report. It's an opportunity to be able to show people the progress that you've made. And, from my vantage point, this is something trustees can plug into really easily. When you look at board members, what do they often say? They often say, I don't want to ask people for money.
Yeah.
And independent schools can show their boards from front-facing stuff like solicitations, because God bless you, if you've got that personality type and you want to do it, we'll take the help. But all the way to the behind-the-scenes stuff, writing thank you notes, making phone calls, and just being part of showing the impact. If a trustee signed up for that, I would consider them a big participant in a school's advancement function. That's a win. But they don't often know that that's an option available to them because schools don't really present it.
That's amazing advice, very actionable for both senior leaders, heads of school, and I imagine board trustees too. So I really appreciate you giving your time today, your expertise. I have one last question for you, and that is if somebody wants to reach out and connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, of course. You can find me on LinkedIn, Mattingly Messina. My website is throughlinedev.com, dev, development. And feel free to reach out. I'm more than anything, I I aspire to do what you've done as someone who has interviewed 100 heads of school. If I can interview 100 heads or 100 development directors, I gladly would. So even for just a conversation, I would be more than happy to talk to school leaders. I always try to thank school leaders at the end of every conversation that we all have like this, because I think that they deserve it and they are doing an unbelievable and very hard job. So thanks to everybody who's listening, who works in schools, that wants to get better at their job and at running these amazing institutions. We are all grateful for you.
Mattingly Messina, founder of Throughline in the San Francisco area. Thank you again. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks, my friend.
Hi there, my friend. I want to thank RG175 for sponsoring this episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Great schools thrive under great leadership. At RG175, we understand that finding the right match between a school and its next leader is a defining moment for both heads and trustees. With extensive experience in independent school leadership and a highly personalized approach, we guide boards through thoughtful search processes and support school leaders through key career transitions. Whether you're looking for your next leadership opportunity or seeking the ideal fit for your school, RG175 is here to help. Visit rg175.com. Again, that's rg175.com to learn more, because behind every successful school is a great leader.